Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and it's time for scallydandle. This time to Honduras, in the company of Melissa Cardoza and her book 13 Colours of the Honduran Resistance, translated by Matt Ginsburg-Jaeckle, published in 2016. Scallydandling videos, that's when I talk about books that I've read as part of my personal challenge to try and read a book by an author from every country in the world. And so this is country for me, number 174 out of 195. So only 21 to go, folks. I'm going to get there eventually, aren't I? Now, I'm going to say two things to help you think whether you actually want to watch this video. One is that I thought this was a rather wonderful book. It was actually a 5-star book for me. But the other is that unless you are particularly interested in Central America, Honduras, resistance movements, the role of women in kind of popular revolutionary or resistance and protest movements, then, or you really want to read a book specifically from Honduras, if none of those things apply to you, then probably go away and watch something else and come back when I'm talking about something different. But if, like me, you are interested in those things, then it's well worth knowing about this book. So, always these scallydandle videos, I start with kind of locating the country for all of us that aren't from Honduras, and then sort of giving a bit of a history, bit of background. So let's get out the trusty globe. We've got South America and North America. Yeah, South America, North America. In between the two, Central America, and the thinnest bit is Panama. And then if you go up from that, that's where Honduras is. So it's got the Caribbean above. It's got the Pacific Ocean below. One side is Nicaragua, the other side El Salvador and Guatemala. So we've got it. Good. Okay, put this down. It's kind of middling, small to middling sized country, I suppose. About population of about 10 million. It's mountainous, a real kind of biodiversity hotspot, like Costa Rica and Guatemala and so on. It's relies on agriculture, predominantly coffee and bananas, although it's got other natural resources, but that's the foundation of the economy. There's a lot of agriculture for export, and then subsistence farming as well, and a bit of sort of fishing and mining. It's not one of the world's poorest countries, but it's poor by Latin American standards. And it's a country that has very high levels of economic inequality within the country. The rich are rich and the poor are really poor. History. What about the history? Well, Central America, as you probably already know, had a really kind of complex and interesting pattern of indigenous cultures. So the sort of western bit of Honduras, or what's now Honduras, would have been, Mayan civilization. That's the one probably that most people that aren't sort of specialists in the sort of ancient and early modern history of Central America, that's the one we've heard of, isn't it? The Lenca people, really important. There's been sort of much more, I suppose, study of the Mayans than some of the other people of the Isthmus, but fascinating if you get into it. And here's today's fun fact for you. Mesoamerica, that area of Mexico and Guatemala and down into the sort of the Central American peninsula, was one of the 6 regions of the world where, so far as we know, writing was independently developed for the first time. Want to know the other 5? You have to look it up, okay? See if you can guess. See if you can work it out. Anyway, it essentially, these sort of cultures, came and went and rose and fell in, different and interesting ways until the Europeans turn up in the Americas. So pre-Columban, post-Columban. It's the big rift, I suppose, in American history. And 1520s, the Spanish basically conquer Honduras. Not that there isn't resistance, the Lenca people were, particularly strong in that. Their leader Lempira supposedly fielded an army of 30,000 people, but ultimately unsuccessful. Pockets that stayed were never fully conquered, and particularly in the north, the sort of what's now known as was called the Mosquito Coast because of it's the Mesquita people, but almost more important than the military conquest was the impact of European diseases like smallpox and measles, that absolutely, more than decimated, the indigenous population. So you get 300 years of Spanish rule, basically, in the area that's now Honduras. And it was only in the 1820s that it got independent from Spain, and then it became an independent republic as Honduras, rather than other sort of bits or coalitions, or in 1838. In the late 19th century, the Honduran government of the time gave kind of huge concessions in the country to US fruit companies, basically banana companies. And that is the origin of the phrase banana republic. Oh, that's the second fun fact for today, isn't it? The introduction to this book says, Honduras is a country where the two main traditional political parties basically grew out of two rival American banana companies. That is Honduran, the sort of the legacy of that in Honduran kind of politics and the economy. Interesting 20th century, some predominantly managed to be a sort of presidential republic, but with periods of military rule, big war with El Salvador, various kind of natural disasters, US kind of influence. Well, I think we all know about the way the United States sort of feel they have the right to influence Central American politics, and that was certainly true in Honduras, and it was at times used as a base for actions in sort of Nicaragua and El Salvador and so on. So complex, tricky, but never had sort of a disastrous civil war in the way that some Central American countries did. Probably the most notable disaster, actually, in the late 20th century was the 1998 Hurricane Mitch, which supposedly set the country back 50 years in terms of the destruction that happened. But, was, relatively, stable presidential republic until 2009, when the then president, Zelaya, Manuel Zelaya, was seen by the country's oligarchs as being too progressive, perhaps associated with Chavez in Venezuela, that they thought things were going that way. And there was a military-led coup, and he was deposed. And this book is very specifically about the period after that coup, and the sort of the movement of almost unexpected popular resistance that happened after the coup, of protest at if the sort of loss of democratic rights at that point, and the important role that women played in that sort of popular resistance and protest movement. And that's Melissa Cardoza, who was born in the 1960s, and she's a journalist, a writer, a poet, a feminist, a lesbian, an organizer. She was involved in that sort of popular resistance movement and wrote this book to kind of, I suppose, kind of honor and celebrate it, in fact. She's aiming to represent that national resistance movement, but more specifically the role of women in that. And I suppose it brought together indigenous sort of indigenous rights sort of campaigners and indigenous people kind of at the grassroots level, feminists, women's organizations, unions, a whole range, I suppose, of people came together. That 2009 coup kind of was a catalyst, perhaps, for that, and including LGBTQ groups in a country that is, very full of machismo. So, both oppression of women and oppression of, LGBTQIA plus people is embedded in Honduran social culture, I guess. What does she do in the actual book? She picks 13 women. Some are named and some are more anonymous. And she writes like little stories, little, almost, how can I describe it? Like vignettes, like little moments of significance involving these 13 women. Sometimes we get their kind of back history. Sometimes it's almost just like an incident, a picture of something that happens. They vary from there's teachers, there's woman that runs a market stall, there's the daughter of a political activist, there's black women, indigenous women, grandmother, whole range, I suppose. And what they have in common is the courage to stand up and protest or to to say their views matter. Trans women, there's a trans woman is one of the 13, so she's trying to kind of get all those different perspectives, and I think her intention is to be inspirational, and for me she really succeeded. I was stunned by these women's courage and by the way that she writes about that courage in a way that really brought it home to me. And there's humor, there's touches of sadness, but also hope and energy and solidarity. A sort of intersectional loyalty and support that is really inspiring and written in lovely prose. I'm going to pause this because I've got a cough. Okay, hope that's all right now. It's a good translation. It's actually a dual language book. So I think, although it's a really good translation, I think it's probably even better if you can read at least a bit of the original Spanish. It's not necessary, but you're going to get an added enjoyment from that, I think, if you can. The other wonderful thing about the book is that it's full of just gorgeous photos. They're not necessarily portraits of the women that are spoken about in the book, probably for, understandable reasons, because, some of them probably, needed to be anonymous, certainly at the point when the book was being written. But, that really added to my sense of connection with the women in the book, I suppose, the photos. So this was published in 2016. It's writing about events sort of around, 2009 to 2013 or so. Where do things stand now? Because, we're talking about recent history, aren't we? Well, I didn't, because I perhaps haven't been fully paying attention, I hadn't realised that Honduras now has its first ever woman president. Her name's Xiomara Castro. She's actually, her husband was the President Manuel Zelaya, who was deposed in the 2009 coup. She took office at the beginning of 2022. On a kind of progressive agenda, including to improve women's rights. I mean, Honduras has one of the highest homicide rates in the world. And femicide is a huge issue within that, and sexual violence against women. And, that is a huge challenge for any government. Corruption is rife. Its position in Central America means it's in that corridor of drug trafficking from South America to the wealthy north, who are the customers, for the drug cartels' profits. And shifting that is going to be enormously challenging. There was a lot of high expectations of her as a new president. A year or so on, is she living up to it? The jury's probably out. Although one thing that was really hopeful to me is that in March, just like about a month and a half ago, she managed to get through an order to unban the use of the emergency contraception, or the morning after pill, which is a huge step forward in a country like Honduras, where yes, women's rights and women's reproductive rights are very poor indeed. So who knows about the future of Honduras, but I really enjoyed this as a book to read. The prose is lovely, and I felt a real emotional connection with the stories in the book.